Before we begin, I just need to give you a trigger warning for sexual violence, childhood sexual abuse, psychological abuse, gaslighting, ableism, ableist slurs, anti-LGBTI+ bigotry, racism, misogyny, transmisandry, gun violence, and a mention of genocide. So I wasn't going to make another video about Lily Orchard. I really wasn't. All I needed to do was make it clear to all of you that I don't think Lily Orchard is a safe person, and that my tacit endorsement of her was in error. And I did that, so I was done. Thing is, a lot of people found my claims of abuse on Lily's part unconvincing. Unfortunately, that's just the situation I was stuck with. I wasn't willing to endanger others by showing you their experiences, but I had no experiences of my own to show you because I was careful to avoid putting myself in a situation where I could be directly abused by Lily. However, the situation has changed somewhat because Lily responded to my video on Tumblr, and since it's about me, and only me, I see no reason why we can't go over it in excruciating detail. So we'll do that, but first, we need to quickly look over the ask she's responding to because context is important. There's a lot going on here, but what I want to focus on is how this anon presents my beliefs. They say,
he says the writing contest you had cancelled was restrictive and bigoted because you wanted a female-on-female relationship and romantic in it only, because apparently that somehow means you have something against aromantic people.
There are a lot of problems with this, but what I want to focus on is how my reasoning isn't present. Sure, they explain that I found the contest restrictive and bigoted because it was exclusively about FF romances, and this is technically an explanation, but it doesn't tell you why the contest being this way caused me to consider it bigoted and restrictive. Let's edit this anon statement slightly and see how dramatically it changes when we include some, not all, but some of the why.
He says the writing contest you had cancelled was restrictive and bigoted because you had wanted a female-on-female relationship, because it made many LGBT+ people with other identities feel excluded, and that somehow means you have something against aromantic people.
Suddenly, the argument isn't as strong. In fact, it may have caused you to notice another problem. The anon focuses solely on aromantic people, which is very misleading. In my previous video, I argued that the contest was restrictive and bigoted because it very explicitly banned numerous LGBT+ and non-LGBT+ identities. Trans people of all kinds, men, people who date men, people who date non-binary people, and yes, aromantic people. I lamented not only being unable to write characters like myself, but also being unable to write representation for more marginalized identities. I used the example of being unable to write non-binary rep for my non-binary friends. Yet no one talks about that. They only talk about the exclusion of aromantic people. And I think the reason they do that is because pushing for the inclusion of aromantic people in a romance writing competition sounds nonsensical. It sounds like a contradiction in terms. That is a very easy position to demonize as, I can only assume, me arguing that the entire romance genre should be broken down in the name of hyper-inclusion. But the position of don't needlessly exclude trans people and men from your contest isn't. Now, I do personally think that aromantic people should be allowed to write romance from an aromantic perspective, and that the rules should be opened up to allow this. I think they can subvert the genre in interesting ways, and I think it's a crime, honestly, to shut down that diversity of thought. And I would also argue that this wouldn't cause the romance genre to disintegrate as aromantic people are a minority, and that in fact you're more likely to end up with a unique subgenre of romance. And I don't really have a point, I just think the idea of an aromance subgenre is really, really interesting. But my point is, even if you disagree with all of that, and you think that it's literally impossible for aromantic people to write romance at all, you can still sympathize and empathize with them being left out and think that, maybe, Lily should have at least considered some sort of minor accommodation for aromantic people, like letting them write platonic or queer platonic relationships instead of romantic relationships, or having another writing contest down the line that they could participate in fully, or maybe, let them write romantic relationships that later become queer platonic due to one of the characters being aromantic. Or what if both characters are aromantic but they don't know that, so they try to do a romantic relationship and they have to learn that it just isn't working for either of them, and they have to figure out what does. That exploration of romance and intimacy and what that looks like and feels like for different people could be really interesting. And I know I'm getting really off topic here, but in addition to this just being interesting to me, the assumption that it's okay to leave no room for aromantic people, so long as that exclusion isn't malicious, is not something I could let go without a thorough critique. The slogan is, acceptance without exception. Not, oh, I excluded you by accident, and even though it's been pointed out to me that's what I was doing, I'm going to keep doing it because I don't want to make some very minor changes. But unceremoniously getting back on topic, the takeaway is that the way this anon summarizes my arguments is very clearly incomplete on a structural level. Even if you were willing to take this at face value, there's nothing for you to take. All they tell you is roughly which events motivated me to reach my conclusions, and even that isn't accurate. For example, they claim that I think Lily discounts sexual assault because of what she said about Biden, when in reality I think she engaged in rape apologetics because of what she said about Tara Reade. This person is obviously not an accurate source of information. Even if Lily can prove I'm entirely wrong on every count, she should not be letting this pass. So, let's watch as she lets all of this pass. Looking at the response, before we even read any of the specifics, I can see issues. You may notice the lack of quotes. Ironically, this is a problem I discussed in my previous video where I compared the nation's reporting to that of the Associated Press, and the problem was, basically, that the nation could forward conclusions that you couldn't dispute. When the Associated Press concluded that Tara Reade's allegations were dubious because Biden's former staffers denied them, I could argue that the staffers' claims were themselves dubious because the Associated Press included quotes from them where they explained their reasoning. When the nation did the same, there were no quotes, and so there could be no dispute. These one-sided narratives are highly exploitable. You're presented with a story that is wholly of the author, and therefore internally consistent, but unbeholden to reality. So whether or not you accept it is essentially down to a coin flip, or more likely, it's down to whether or not you have a positive or negative opinion of the author. And it's a pretty slick production, I must admit, because Lily's response looks strong when it's full of reasons why I'm wrong and why none of my arguments make sense. It only begins to look questionable if you go into it with the understanding that Lily has no obligation to present my arguments accurately. But it is rather hypocritical of me to rail on Lily for presenting criticism absent context as I do that very thing. So let's look at the specifics of her response. She begins by explaining that
the vast majority of the video is responding to an article I posted months ago and deleted the post shortly afterward.
On first reading, this probably sounds like a pretty solid defense. The majority of my video is responding to an old, deleted article. I'm making something out of nothing. But what if I told you that, far from being a defense, this is actually a tacit admission of guilt? Think of it this way. Imagine if the article in question was on a totally benign topic, like a day in the life of a fairy penguin at the Perth Zoo. If that were the case, Lily wouldn't avoid discussing the topic of the article. She'd scarcely talk about anything else. If this article had been about fairy penguins, she could begin and end her response with, "He's pissed at me about penguins, what is even happening?" If this article had been about fairy penguins, deliberately glossing over its contents like this would actually mean more work for her and a weaker defense. So she must be hiding something. Well, she's hiding that the article was about rape. More specifically, she's hiding that the article was about why a certain survivor of rape should not be believed. Most importantly, she's hiding that she wasn't sharing this article to disagree with it. Why did she hide this? I can only presume it's because her response would have been less convincing if she'd said, "The majority of the video is responding to an article I shared months ago detailing why Tara Reade was lying about being raped, despite the fact that I deleted the article shortly afterward." How does Lily Orchard control the narrative? Currently, I see her doing three things. First and foremost, as we've already discussed at length, she's omitting key information. She is omitting very basic information you need to know before you can even begin to assess the situation. She's expecting you to dismiss 40 minutes of criticism from me without even knowing the subject of my criticism. She's expecting you to believe in her innocence without even knowing what she did. Never mind why I take issue with it. Secondly, she's attempting to minimize and distance herself from her actions instead of owning them. Instead of explaining exactly what it is she did and why my criticism has never or no longer applies, she's trying to make her actions appear as minuscule as possible by emphasizing how little time the article was up for and how much time has passed since. Thirdly, she's presenting my actions absent the reasoning that motivates them. Ironically, this is something Lily and many of her fans criticized Sarah Z for. They said that you cannot show only the climax of a rant, that you can't show someone's anger without showing why they're angry. Here, Lily won't even show you that much, yet she expects you to believe that my criticisms were not only incorrect, but so discordant with reality as to be nonsensical. And finally, she's priming you to make some very, very flawed assumptions. Let's talk about them. Most notably, Lily is priming you to assume that time has anything to do with why I take issue with her posting that article. After all, she wouldn't talk about time if it weren't relevant, right? The thing is, if you watch my video, I talk a lot about what the article says, and what Lily says, and what Lily would have to believe in order to agree with the article. But I talk very little about the impact the article and her post may have had on anyone reading her Tumblr. In fact, I don't talk about it at all. So when Lily argues that time has passed and that she deleted her post quickly, my response is, so what? My criticism does not and has never had anything to do with time or even material harm. It's about Lily's beliefs. Lily is also simultaneously insinuating that you should no longer take issue with her actions because time has passed. And this is a weirder and weirder argument the more I think about it, because she's talking about this article like, it's not a big deal, don't even worry about it, but at the same time, she's leaning very hard on the old trope of, if you don't forgive someone solely because an arbitrary amount of time has passed, then you're holding a grudge. So, which is it? Is she innocent? Or are we obligated to forgive her? Lily is also priming you to assume that the vast majority of my video contains nothing of value. If you trust Lily, you expect she would engage with any worthwhile criticisms I have, so if she doesn't, that must mean I have none. And while this could be true, it's also true that it would be very easy for her to show some examples of these worthless arguments so that you wouldn't have to take her word for it. I won't argue that my criticisms of Lily are objectively worthwhile, but I will argue that Lily should respect this as an open question if she decides to leave it as one. Dismissing my arguments based on the mere assertion that they're worthless is not only disrespectful to me and the hours of careful work I put into my video, but much more importantly, it discourages her audience from questioning her, which, it should go without saying, is highly exploitable. And finally, because of the previous three assumptions, Lily is priming you to assume that I'm malicious or, at best, simply clueless. She speaks of my video as though it's 40 minutes of ranting over something that has scarcely anything to do with her. Either I'm using an irrelevant article as an excuse to attack her, or I'm angry at her over an irrelevant article because I'm too stupid to realize it's no longer relevant to her. And this is, I have to admit, a little bit frustrating, because I was aware when I released my video that the post had been taken down, and I was aware that someone might try to invalidate my arguments for that reason. Yet I responded anyway, because my issue never had anything to do with the post being publicly available. I can't help but feel there's some irony in Lily treating me as clueless when she's only perceiving me as such due to her own overly simplistic view of the issue. So that was one sentence of Lily's response. Let's move on to the next one. She says,
there's some weird rationalizing in the comments about, well, Lily posted it for the total of 30 minutes, so I'm treating it as if it's her words, which is one of the weirdest leaps in logic I've ever seen months after deleting the post to the article.
So, I don't mean to be inflammatory, but that figure of 30 minutes is a lie. If you watch my previous video, you'll even see when I show a screenshot of the post that it says posted 1 week ago. And when I told Ethel about the response, they estimated that the post had been up for at least 19 days. Do you know how many half hours there are in 19 days? 912 of them. And yes, I know you could read this 30 minutes figure as hyperbole, but I don't think it is. Not only does she use the same figure later, but the second time, she states it plainly, without any kind of hedge or other indication that it's not to be taken as literal. Regardless of whether this is due to incompetence or malice on Lily's part though, she's still being misleading either way. Hyperbole should either use context or exaggeration or the previously discussed hedges and qualifiers or the inclusion of the true figure itself to indicate that the hyperbole is not to be taken literally. If Lily had said that the article was only up for 2 minutes, or it was up for basically 30 minutes, or it was up for 2 weeks, which is basically 30 minutes, that wouldn't necessarily fix the problem, but it would be a lot less problematic. There's a difference between using hyperbole to get across a certain feeling, and using it to obfuscate what happened. And again, she's minimizing and distancing herself. She's trying to convince you that the issue this article represents is so small that it's not even worth consideration. And again, this is an article she posted in order to convince people that a survivor of rape was lying about being raped. Second, I don't treat the article as her own words at any point, and Lily seems to know this because if you look carefully, you'll notice that she attributes this claim to the comments. This also is a lie. I saw no such comment on my video. I saw a lot of people talking about how their opinions of Lily have changed for the worse because of her sharing that article, but no one saying the article is her words. But even if it were true, I really fail to see what this has to do with me. Sometimes people are wrong on my videos, and I let them be wrong. Just because I approve a comment, that doesn't mean I approve of it, it just means it wasn't so heinous as to be unpublishable. What Lily has said here really has nothing to do with my video or my criticisms of her, so I have no idea why she's saying it in her post explaining why she's not responding to my video. I can't help but think that, intentional or not, she could cause a lot of people to conclude that this is something I did. It's what I thought she was saying on my first reading. But the main issue here is that Lily is grossly simplifying reality. She's implying that either something is her words or it has nothing to do with her. But that is, of course, just not true. This is an article Lily chose to forward as a reason why you should believe what she believes. She presented it as a replacement for her own arguments. It may not be exactly the same as if it were her words, but she chose to have it speak for her, and so it reflects on her to a very high degree. In addition to that, the article would still reflect on Lily if she had disagreed with it. It would have reflected positively, but nonetheless, it would still reflect on her. Because, despite Lily's insistence that only her words reflect on her, the fact is, her words don't actually matter. It's her beliefs that matter, and we can learn a lot about what someone believes based purely on what they agree and disagree with. How many times have we, and Lily in particular, dragged someone over the fiery coals for voting for right-wing political candidates? They don't need to explicitly tell us that they want the poor to suffer, that they want black and brown people to be ousted from their respective countries, that they want to control women's bodies, that they want LGBTI+ people to be legislated out of existence, and that they want to genocide and abuse the disabled. Their actions made all of that crystal clear. And if you're still not convinced, here is the issue plainly. Lily, unironically, in complete seriousness, told you that one of the reasons you should not believe Tara Reid is because she was motivated by her views on Putin. And I'm not just saying that because of the article, she said as much in her post. Issue is, in order to bolster that claim, Lily linked an article where the author admits that Reid's views on Putin have nothing to do with the credibility of her allegations, where the author all but admits that they were poisoning the well. Lily's actions here do more than cast doubt on her understanding of sexual violence and rape culture. They cast doubt on the reliability of her reading comprehension. She cannot dismiss what that says about her simply because it isn't her words. And Lily seems to agree with me on all of this because she still refuses to tell you what that article is about. If that article really didn't reflect on her in any way because it's not her words, then why is she so afraid of it? In fact, if this article is really such a poor representation of her views, then why didn't she say that in the beginning? Why waste our time with all these excuses about it being taken down months ago? Was demonizing me as a lunatic who's looking for an excuse to hate her really so important that it had to take precedence over an actual argument? Moving on, we have the second paragraph. We're going to skip that for now. After that, Lily says,
"The writing contest was explicitly about writing a woman proposing to her girlfriend, and it's somehow bigoted to disqualify something that is not in line with that theme."
Again, she's acting as though I'm uninformed when, in fact, I disagree with her. I understand that disqualifying stories that feature romances involving trans women, non-binary people, men, and aromantic people is in line with the rules. This simply fails to move me. In fact, this is the exact opposite of a defense. I criticize Lily's rules for being exclusionary and harmful to many people in her community, and her response is to point out that she's diligently following these harmful rules. Obviously, the correct response in this situation is to change your harmful rules to make them benign, or to explain why I'm mistaken about them being harmful. However, I do feel like there's a worthwhile argument being implied here, even if only accidentally, so I want to make something clear that wasn't in my previous video. It's not inherently bigoted to have a contest specifically for writing lesbian romances. It's okay to cater to a specific identity within the LGBT+ community. The issues arise when you cultivate a diverse audience without making it clear that you intend to cater to a specific identity. You're going to make everyone else feel neglected and unwelcome, and that's not a nice thing to do. But if Lily had just set up a writing contest to cater to lesbians, that wouldn't be so bad. I wouldn't be criticizing her for it, even though I technically think it's wrong. The reason why Lily's writing contest was so heinous in my eyes is because she set it up as a challenge to a number of people she'd been criticizing for their love of fantasy. She tore into people for liking fantasy, told them that a genre they enjoyed and a genre that they wrote in was boring and cliché and pointless. She undermined their self-esteem, treated one of their interests as something to be ashamed of, and made them feel like she was disappointed in them. To a lot of people, the writing contest would have been a way to win back her approval, or to prove her wrong. That contest was a way for people to empower themselves after Lily had degraded and humiliated them. So excluding people in any way is disempowering them yet again. This is why I made such a big deal out of Lily excluding non-lesbians, and this is why the argument of "you don't have to enter" doesn't work. If this had just been a lesbian-themed writing contest she had proposed out of the blue, it would have still sucked for anyone who wanted to write other LGBT+ identities, but it would have been easy enough for us to simply ignore the contest and go look for a contest set by someone less controlling. It's specifically because she not only drew people in, but also hinged part of their self-worth on their participation that the contest's exclusive nature is a problem. But the contest is also problematic in and of itself because it's incredibly toxic to restrict someone's writing that much. Lily didn't just fix the identities of the main characters, but also their relationship, the conflict of the story, the resolution, and even the characters' movements. I've never seen instructions this restrictive for a creative piece, not even English assignments. Lily clearly doesn't want to have a writing contest. She says she does, and she might even think she does, but she doesn't, because she clearly can't handle being confronted with someone else's unbridled creativity. So why did she set up a writing contest when they usually entail doing just that? It's because she wanted to force her community to write in a way she personally likes. It's because she wanted stories about cute gay wives written to her exact specifications, but she didn't want to commission them. Why else would she put the story on rails? That is the problem, which I discussed in my previous video. Lily treats her community as a commodity for her own exploitation, rather than a group of human beings with needs and wants and feelings who she has power and influence over, and that is abusive, and all of that is not only absent, but notoriously difficult to discuss when Lily makes this an issue of following the rules. My criticism of the writing contest is, at its heart, an issue of power dynamics and Lily abusing those power dynamics, yet Lily talks about her own rules like she's beholden to them. She is implicitly denying that she has power in this situation. After that, she says,
"By that logic, I'm discriminating against weaves by not letting people submit Final Fantasy XIV transmogs in my World of Warcraft transmog competition."
And look, I am trying to be charitable, I really am. But I have not seen someone conflate LGBT+ identity with fandoms who wasn't a bigot. Telling a trans person that your writing competition doesn't allow trans characters is not the same as telling a Final Fantasy fan that your competition is for World of Warcraft. It's just not. We understand why identity isn't the same as fandom, right? We get that, right? If nothing else, a Final Fantasy fan has a significantly higher chance of becoming a World of Warcraft fan than a trans person does of becoming a cis lesbian. But even if these things were equivalent, I could still argue that she's being not exactly discriminatory, as fandom is not a protected class, but I can argue that she's being incredibly cruel by disallowing Final Fantasy XIV transmogs in her World of Warcraft transmog competition, so long as I add in the missing context. Imagine that Lily cultivates a diverse audience of people from all different fandoms by talking about these fandoms in her work, even if only occasionally. Imagine she has fans of Star Trek, Star Wars, Percy Jackson, Lord of the Rings, Final Fantasy, and yes, World of Warcraft. Imagine one day she harshly criticizes a number of people spanning all of these fandoms for their poor grammar and punctuation. Then she sets up a writing contest to give them a chance to show that they can write properly. Then imagine that, once the rules for the contest are made public, it turns out that it's very explicitly a contest for World of Warcraft only, despite the fact that she criticized people from every fandom in her community. That is a cruel thing to do, and completely unnecessary. And I take back what I said before, it is discriminatory. She would be treating the World of Warcraft fans more favourably in that situation, while most of her community have to endure her harsh criticism and being goaded into participating in a contest that doesn't interest them, or, depending on how familiar they are with World of Warcraft, that is impossible for them to participate in. The World of Warcraft fans only have to endure her harsh criticism, and they're effectively being rewarded by being allowed to write about something they're interested in. That is discriminatory, and it's needlessly cruel. Just get rid of the unnecessary restrictions, thereby opening up the contest to every fandom in your community. Lily's constantly railing on people for refusing to do incredibly simple and easy things, yet she's throwing a colossal tantrum over me telling her to hit backspace a few times. After that, she complains about people who were
incessantly nagging me for loopholes.
This, again, shows how she sees her audience as people who need to serve her, and not the other way around. She sees dissatisfaction in her community's response to an activity that is, in theory, for them, and instead of processing this as a problem with her failing to tailor her contest to her community, she processes it as a problem with her community failing to properly engage with her contest. I'm not saying that Lily can't propose a writing contest that her audience dislikes, because obviously she can, but that doesn't make it right, either in the sense of it being a good idea or a moral one. And the idea that her audience doesn't have the right to criticize or complain about the way she treats them, it should go without saying that this is highly exploitable. And it's also abuse. The idea of, I can technically do this, therefore it's okay and you're not allowed to criticize it, is textbook abuse. It is such a blatant example of abuse that it actually triggered me when I first wrote this. So much of the abuse I experienced growing up was just like this. There was one person in particular who used to do incredibly hurtful and malicious things, and whenever he was called out on it, he would frame it as us telling him not to exercise his basic rights and freedoms. Like, whenever I was sad, he'd make a big show of how happy he was because he wanted to make me feel like my suffering was a good thing. He wanted me to feel alone and unsafe and utterly worthless and unloved. And it worked. It fucking worked. But if we called him out on that, he'd say, "So I'm not allowed to be happy? I guess I'll just never be happy then." And how could we argue with that? Even if his happiness was hurting me, how horrible is it to tell someone that they can't be happy? This is what Lily's doing with the writing contest. She's framing the harm she's doing as a consequence of her exercising basic freedoms. So when we tell her to stop, she can victimize herself. When we say, "Lily, it's not nice to exclude people from your writing contest," she replies, "So I'm not allowed to have a lesbian writing contest? Lesbians are cancelled now. Is that it?" And even if we hold her hand through everything and explain exactly how to ethically hold a lesbian writing contest, she can very easily reframe that too. So I have to get a written permit every time I want to have a lesbian writing contest then? And by this point, we're so far from the issue that you can't even remember that this discussion started with criticizing Lily, not demanding or even asking that she change her behavior, but merely criticizing it. Criticisms, apparently, aren't allowed because they infringe on Lily's freedom. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's only a stone's throw away from the idea of criticizing my ideas is a violation of my free speech. And you might argue that none of this applies because it's all hypothetical, that it's not fair for me to criticize Lily for what I imagine she'll do. Put a pin in that. After that, she says,
"These kind of weird logical missteps and deliberate cluelessness are a red flag to me."
And this, I have to admit, makes me a bit angry. What logical missteps? If anything, Lily's the one who's been misstepping. Remember, her first argument in defense of her innocence was a tacit admission of guilt. What deliberate cluelessness? Once again, Lily is the one who's been either actively ignoring or denying my beliefs and arguments. Even if I'm gracious enough to excuse her from the obligation of watching my video or reading the associated transcript, she should at least catch the contradictions and holes in her own arguments. This is part of the reason I take issue with Lily's lack of quotes. Even though I didn't explicitly preempt any of the arguments Lily makes in this response, a lot of that is due to her entirely missing the point. If she had been forced to engage with my actual arguments, there simply wouldn't be room for her to say any of this. Lily controls the narrative by, quite literally, controlling the narrative. Every word she prints from me is a word she has to work around, but if she writes everything in her own words, all she has to do is make sure she broadly covers the same topics I cover in my video, and she has free reign for the rest. After that, she says,
"They make me wonder, okay, what is he actually mad about? Because it isn't any of this."
And again, this makes me a little bit angry. I spent weeks carefully researching and writing almost an hour worth of video explaining exactly why I take issue with Lily Orchard, and she's dismissing all of it. Not just my literal words and not just the work that went into it, but also the ethics behind that work, my dedication to being transparent, to being fair, to evidencing my claims, and above everything else, to preserving and improving the well-being of the people around me. Yes, even the people I dislike, even Lily Orchard. What Lily is accusing me of is going against everything I stand for. And based on what? Nothing. She hasn't actually demonstrated any logical missteps or deliberate cluelessness on my part. She doesn't provide a shred of evidence that I'm being dishonest. She doesn't even invent a possible motivation for my supposed dishonesty. She just declares that because she doesn't understand my criticisms she has largely ignored, that I must be dishonest. Do me a favor, will you? Imagine the tongue lashing Lily would give me if I asserted that she was being dishonest based on evidence as flimsy as this. As it is, she's already given me a tongue lashing for criticizing her for the things I can prove she said and did. She complains that my criticism is worse than vitriolic backlash she faced for using a slur because
that was a bad thing I actually did in reality and not just someone's imagination.
And I didn't realize this for the first 20 readings or so, but this is textbook gaslighting. This is such a blatant example of gaslighting that I didn't think it could exist outside a textbook. She's saying that the things I criticized her for, many of which I have physical proof of, happened in my imagination. She's saying that my perception of demonstrable facts is wrong. How did I imagine her sharing an article that I have a screenshot of her sharing? Explain that for me. And I know that technically she's not arguing that I imagined her sharing the article, but rather that I imagined it being bad despite it definitely being okay. But the problem with that is, the question of whether or not something is bad is a moral question. It's not objectively verifiable, so if she decides to dismiss it as something I imagined, I have no way to disprove that. Once again, this is highly, highly, highly exploitable, and she can do it to you too. What Lily has done here is frame this as me imagining she did something bad when we actually disagree on the morality of what happened. And the problem with that is, just because we disagree, that doesn't mean Lily's wrongdoing only exists in my imagination. For one, and this is a bold idea, I know, Lily could simply be wrong. But also, being wrong about something isn't the same thing as imagining something. It is possible that Lily did nothing wrong, that I believe she did something wrong, and that neither of us are imagining. But Lily doesn't acknowledge that, because if she admitted that this is about us disagreeing on the morality of the situation, rather than a case of me being stupid, malicious, or delusional, then, well, we'd have to have a discussion on the morality of Lily's behavior, and she'd lose control of the narrative, and perhaps leave some of the people in her community with the impression that they might ought to listen to me. Following that, she does something strange. She's complained that she can't take my criticism because it's not based in actual wrongdoing, but she tries anyway. I apologize in advance for this because it's violent, honestly. She says,
"What am I supposed to do? Next time I delete/retract a post, have a big performative spiel about it just in case some dipshit really needs their hand held through everything?"
If you watched my previous video, you might have noticed that I present a lot of problems with Lily Orchard, but very few solutions. This is partly because it was never for her in the first place, so I didn't write it with her in mind. But it's also because I thought the solutions were pretty obvious, and I didn't think it was necessary to over-explain my position like I'm talking to one of my abusive family who can find unimaginably convoluted and esoteric loopholes in everything, while simultaneously insisting that understanding simple instructions is beyond them. But apparently, that's not the case, so let's talk solutions. I criticize Lily for a problematic post, and she infers that I think her solution of deleting it without comment is inadequate, which is correct. But then Lily pretends that this means I must want her to collapse into a sobbing mess of crocodile tears as a shallow display of regret, which is significantly less correct. Here's my counter-argument. Why does it have to be an apology? Why not a clarifying statement? Because sure, we're all smart enough to deduce that she took down that post because she no longer stood by it, but there's no way for us to deduce why. The cynical explanation is that she got backlash and she didn't want to deal with it anymore. But even if I want to be charitable, she could have taken that post down for any number of reasons, ranging from changing her mind about that particular article to completely reversing positions on the veracity of Tara Reid's allegations. Without a statement, there's just no way for us to know. And forgive my cynicism, but I think that might be by design. I can't help but notice that there's been a thick cloud of obfuscation over this entire situation from the very beginning, and I also can't help but notice that this figure it out for yourself attitude would be very convenient if Lily still believed Tara Reid was guilty of lying about being raped. But the upside of this whole mess is that it's somewhat amusing for Lily to characterize me as a, quote, dipshit who needs their hand held through everything, unquote, when this response has essentially been me holding her hand through everything. She also says,
"Next time I hold a contest, just let people completely disregard what the contest is actually about. Let someone think my contest about romance is an aggressive stance against aromantic people."
I criticize Lily for holding a writing contest that excludes large swaths of marginalized people, and I criticize her for using the contest to manipulate and coerce her community into behaving the way she wants them to. And she concludes that this must mean I think no one should follow any rules ever, and also that I think she did it just to spite aromantic people for some reason. Instead, my counter is that she could just make more reasonable rules that fit her community better and don't hurt people. And then it won't be such a problem when she expects people to follow them. And she could maybe let go of her stubbornness enough to realize that her rules aren't set in stone and that she can actually change them sometimes in response to feedback. And also, she could learn that apathy is a thing, and that you can make life worse for someone without setting out to hurt them. Also, once again, she's talking down to me like I just don't understand the situation, claiming that her contest is about romance, when, as I discussed earlier, and in my previous video, she very explicitly forwarded the contest as a challenge to fantasy writers to get them out of their comfort zones. By telling you that her contest is actually about romance, Lily isn't just oversimplifying the situation, but she's also doing a lie. We can see she's ignoring very obvious interpretations of my arguments and very obvious solutions to the problems I criticize her for in favor of these ridiculous, hyperbolic, misleading suggestions that are designed to be broken. And you remember that pin from before? It's time to take that pin out. While these reactions to my criticisms may not seem at all like what I discussed before, they follow the same principle. Criticisms of Lily's behaviour are framed as demands that she refrain from exercising basic freedoms or follow impossibly stringent rules when she does. The focus is taken off of how her behaviour is harmful and how she can make it benign, and is instead put on how unreasonable my demands are, despite the fact that I didn't even make any demands yet. And that, in fact, is key. If she allows people to make demands, then she has to deal with the possibility that those demands are actually quite reasonable. But if she criticizes our demands before we make them, she can attribute whatever absurdity to us she likes. And if we complain about her strawmanning our position like that, about her putting words in our mouths, she can complain, "Don't waste my time telling me what I'm doing wrong if you don't want to tell me how to fix it." It doesn't matter how unfair or even bad faith Lily's responses are. If the focus is only ever on her and how poorly she's being treated, then anything can be framed as an attack. That's the problem with, or rather the point of, this adversarial approach to having one's behaviour criticised. Basically, if you saw my second Rachel Oates video, she's doing that thing where she's not actually being attacked, but she behaves as though she is, and that's enough to sell the illusion. She also says,
"Next time a long-time viewer completely ignores something I've complained about for a long time, don't get angry about it for all one day, lest the vultures pretend it was a bigger controversy than it actually was because there was nothing else to latch onto."
So, for those of you who did not watch my previous video, I criticised Lily for lashing out at a viewer for asking her if she was okay following her abruptly ending a stream, and you remember before when I said that I didn't bother discussing solutions? Well, this time, I did. I explained exactly what Lily could have done differently to achieve the same goal without causing the problem. So this time, it's extra weird for her to mockingly ask me what I expected her to do. Like, the last two were indicative of a lack of critical thinking skills, but this one is indicative of a lack of reading skills. I told her, plainly, that all she had to do was set her boundary without being vicious about it. Instead of saying, "Mind your own business," just say, "I don't want to talk about it," or "I want to be left alone right now." It's not hard. But despite all that, I have to admit that this argument is of a higher caliber than the other two, because I can't counter it. I agree wholeheartedly. You shouldn't abuse your fucking audience. This is honestly sad. She's like, "Are you seriously telling me I shouldn't yell at people on the internet for asking me if I'm okay?" This is supposed to be a point against me. She thinks she's exaggerated my beliefs to the point of absurdity, but no, my actual position is this, just without all the excuses thrown in. Speaking of, I have to go through all of these excuses. I just have to. It's going to be long and boring and tortuous, but I can't let her excuse abusive behaviour unchallenged. First, she accuses this person of ignoring an instruction from her, but that's assuming a lot. She can't read this person's mind. She doesn't know what this person has or has not seen from her. Personally, I wouldn't assume that a viewer had seen every video on my channel, despite the fact that you could chew through all of my content in the space of a weekend. Lily's been producing and deleting content for a decade or more. She has weekly live streams she doesn't publish. She has a Tumblr that she's constantly deleting posts from, and goodness knows what else. No one can be expected to keep up with all of that. The people in her community have school and jobs and families and hobbies and lives outside of compulsively checking and memorizing everything Lily has said. The fact is, whatever rule Lily's alluding to here isn't clear. Despite being a fairly dedicated fan of hers for at least 2 years, I haven't the faintest clue what she's talking about. She cannot reasonably justify the claim that this person is deliberately ignoring her. But even if this person were deliberately ignoring an instruction from her, that's also perfectly understandable. Lily seemed to break down midstream. That's not only a concerning situation, but an unprecedented one. It would be one thing if this was something that just happened sometimes and Lily had already explained why it happens and how she deals with it and how she wants others to deal with it, but it's not. This was an unusual and mysterious event. It's normal for people to disregard rules and push boundaries in a situation like this, where someone's deeply upset and no one knows why. This concern is a normal human behavior on such a basic level that to ask someone to deny it is to ask them to deny their own humanity. While Lily is willing to pass off her own emotional outbursts as a tolerable imperfection that come with being human, if your own feelings cause you to stray from a robotic standard of obedience, Lily treats you as though you've committed a grave sin. She also tries to pass this unjustifiable anger off as a one-time incident. Don't get angry about it for all of one day? But it's not. You know it's not, because you've been going through this response with me. You've seen her vitriol, her ableism, and her abuse. For all you might try to argue that it's okay this time, because I provoked her by criticizing the things she said and did, you can't, because she's provoked me with painful, abusive, triggering language and treatment, and yet I haven't responded in kind. Cruelty isn't something that just happens when you're under pressure or unhappy. It's a habit, and it's also a choice. I know it's a choice because I used to be a toxic little shit only a few months ago, until it caused me to hurt my friend, and that caused me to reassess my priorities, and I chose then and there not to ever tear someone down again, and I haven't done it since. Oh, we also know this isn't a one-time incident for Lily because this is what her Discord looks like. When Lily tells you that she just got angry this one time because she was stressed, she is lying to you. This is just how she chooses to treat people. Finally, Lily insinuates that I'm trying to make this into a controversy when it isn't. Once again, she's minimizing. In this case, she probably genuinely thinks that this isn't a big deal, but I know she's wrong, because I know the person who sent that ask, and I know that Lily's response made them cry. I know that Lily and a lot of her community would argue that their reaction was due to weakness on their part rather than anything Lily did, but those people are liars, and we don't have to listen to them. Look, the fact is, if you're going to call a child weak because they were upset by a YouTuber they liked lashing out at them, then I can call Lily weak for getting angry at a child asking her if she was okay. I have to ask, why is it so hard to expect Lily to just ignore them? Why does an adult woman have so little fortitude and restraint? Why is it we have to coddle an adult woman and professional YouTuber, but we're supposed to criticize a child because they should have somehow known better? And why was she even on Tumblr in the first place? She clearly wasn't in a headspace to be dealing with public relations, so why did she put herself in a situation where she'd have to deal with public relations? When did Lily manage to convince so many people that holding her to the most basic standards of common sense was asking too much? When did she convince us that she's allowed to do whatever she likes because we technically can't stop her? When will we start holding her accountable? Lily goes on to claim that I did all the things I criticised Sarah Z for, those being
jumping to conclusions based on little to no information, arbitrarily deciding what can be taken at face value and what can be dismissed based on confirmation bias, and complaining about things that were already addressed and he would have known about if he knew how to fucking read.
First of all, those aren't things I criticised Sarah Z for. My style back then was as amateurish as it is now. I responded to Sarah's claims by demonstrating that they were wrong, either by doing basic research or by pointing to sections of the source material that contradicted her. My criticism of Sarah Z was that she lied, plain and simple. But this isn't really about Sarah Z. This is about Lily introducing her own criticisms of me in a way that makes me look like a hypocrite. Thing is, I don't see how these criticisms could be accurate. Even if I assume that Lily's reading of my video isn't wrong, I still don't see how I could have possibly done any of the things she's accusing me of. Like, criticizing her for a deleted and now obsolete Tumblr post might be silly, but it's hardly jumping to conclusions or arbitrarily deciding what can be taken at face value. It's barely a case of complaining about things that were already addressed, and that's only because I'm temporarily accepting Lily's assertion that deleting something without comment is somehow addressing it. I can, however, see examples of her doing these things. For example, she concludes based on literally nothing that I have a super secret reason for being upset with her. Even if I assume all of her criticisms of me were actually correct, it still doesn't make sense for her to assume I'm being disingenuous. I mean, she's consistently treated me like I'm dumber than the average donkey, so why wouldn't she assume I genuinely believe what I'm saying and that I'm just stupid? As for her arbitrarily deciding what can and can't be taken at face value based on confirmation bias, when an obviously simplified and incomplete version of my argument is brought to her by an anonymous Tumblr user, she takes it as completely accurate, but the idea that I genuinely believe the things I claim to believe is dismissed as preposterous. And as for complaining about things that were already addressed, Lily threw a tantrum over being told not to lash out at her audience and complained about what she was supposed to do, despite the fact that I explained exactly what she did wrong and exactly what to do instead. This was in the video itself, by the way, not tucked away on my Twitter or in a video I've since privated. Speaking of research, she implies that all of my problems would be resolved if I knew how to fucking read, but if that were the case, why didn't she write out any of these resolutions for us to fucking read? Why the obfuscation? It's almost as if she has nothing and she just really doesn't want to admit it. Finally, she says,
"Good luck trying to claim I hate aromantic people."
Which I never actually claimed. I said she's bigoted against aromantic people, and also literally everyone else who isn't a cis lesbian, but that's not the same thing as hating them. Apathy and ignorance and ingrained biases motivate bigotry much more often than outright hatred. Then she claims that she can't hate aromantic people because her blog is filled with aropositivity, and, of course, if you're at all marginalized in any way, you'll know that this means less than nothing, especially in the face of someone failing to take on board a very basic criticism. Like, reblog all the aropositivity you want, but if you throw a tantrum and play the victim at someone saying, "Hey, this thing you're doing is making aro people feel left out," then, well, you're not the ally you think you are. Anyway, I know this has been poorly organised and boring, and it's really dragging on. We're nearly done. It's time to go back to that paragraph we skipped earlier. Lily said,
"Also, being a sexual assault victim, I'm not at all inclined to listen to 40 minutes of ranting about sexual assault for obvious reasons."
She didn't watch the video. She spent like 10 paragraphs explaining how my arguments don't make sense and I'm obviously lying, and she didn't even watch the video. She didn't even pop in for long enough to notice that I had a transcript she could read instead. I also love how she acts like this is somehow my fault. The only reason I discuss sexual assault at all in the video is because I had to deconstruct her poor take on it, but from the way she talks about it, you could be forgiven for thinking that I put an unrelated discussion in my video just to make her suffer. And look, I'm not saying she has to watch the video. Obviously, she doesn't, especially considering it's potentially triggering for her. But if she can't watch the video, she can't criticize it. That's not even a moral proclamation on my part, it's a fact. You cannot criticize arguments you haven't seen. And I get it. I understand the frustration of seeing someone get sexual assault wrong and being forced to choose between saying nothing and putting yourself through hours of psychological harm. I get that because I've had to make that choice myself. And you know why I've had to make that choice myself? Because I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. Lily did not see fit to include this fact in her analysis. She brands my discussion of sexual assault a rant, despite the fact that she hasn't seen it, and it also comes from a survivor. Why? You might be tempted to argue that she assumed the worst because she didn't know I was a survivor. All she knew is that I was a man telling a woman what she got wrong about sexual assault. Except, that doesn't hold up, because while you might not have been aware of the context of this discussion, because Lily deliberately left it out, she knew full well that I made my video in response to her attacking a survivor of rape. She knew she was on the wrong side of this issue. The reason why she branded my analysis a rant isn't because she had any reason to think it was, it's because she thought she could get away with it. Why? Because I'm a man, and men tend to have terrible takes on sexual assault, so she was banking on you dismissing my perspective for no reason other than my gender. And here's where I pull the rug out from under you, new viewers. I'm not just a man, but specifically a trans man. The sexual abuse I endured that as a child, specifically because my abuser saw me as female. And Lily really should know all of this, because it's in my Twitter bio. You know, the bio of the Twitter that I talk about in my previous video, and also another video that I know Lily saw because she shared it. For someone who constantly attacks people for failing to research to her satisfaction, she really is bad at doing basic research herself. The way Lily uses my gender to dismiss my lived experience would be wrong regardless of whether I were trans or cis, but given that I'm trans and the complexities that go along with that, I can't help but feel it's especially disgusting. Trans men experience misogyny, both pre- and post-transition. Many of us have a complicated relationship with womanhood, manhood, and feminism because of that, and many of us continue to feel a connection to women's issues, especially as they continue to affect us. It isn't as simple as saying trans men are men, therefore trans men don't understand women's issues. The fact that I'm perceived as a man today does nothing to erase the 18 years of misogyny I endured beforehand, or the misogyny I'll endure today from people who don't perceive me as a man, or the misogyny I'll endure today from men who perceive me as a man and therefore conclude that I'll be comfortable with their misogyny, or the ambient misogyny I experience every day from living in a misogynistic society, or the many issues such as abortion and contraceptive access that, despite primarily affecting women, also affect me. Treating trans men as identical to cis men and excluding us from women's issues might sound progressive and affirming, but it is, in fact, an act of violence against us. It disempowers us and strengthens systems of oppression that harm us. And throwing trans men under the bus seems to be a pattern for Lily, because recently, someone asked her on Tumblr why trans women are so hated while trans men receive mainstream acceptance, and she didn't correct them. We are currently living in a world where a billionaire who defined the fantasy genre for an entire generation has taken a bold stance against transgender people. And does she engage in a lot of trans misogynistic fearmongering about women's spaces? Yeah, she does. But she also viciously attacks including trans men in our own reproductive healthcare and lies about poor, innocent lesbians being turned into men because of homophobia and gender stereotypes. Trans men are regularly stripped of our autonomy, condescended to, and sexualized by transphobic narratives and people. And this isn't even a recent thing. Anyone remember the whole transgender bullshit that was going around in 2014? That word was almost exclusively used to attack trans men and AFAB non-binary people. The idea that trans men have mainstream acceptance is laughable. But Lily seems to believe it because she simply has not been paying the slightest bit of attention to trans men's issues, and that inattention has caused her to do violence against trans men more than once, She really is bigoted against LGBT+ people who aren't exactly like her, simply because she can't bring herself to listen to or care about other people. So, in conclusion, Lily's response is nothing more than a weak obfuscation of her obvious wrongdoings coupled with blatant abuse apologetics. Her behaviour is so indefensible that she can't afford to engage with my criticisms on even the simplest level. Instead, she has to strawman me and poison the well by casting me as an idiot with such a tenuous grasp on reality that she's arguably accusing me of delusion. This is not a convincing response on any level. This isn't even an internally consistent response. This response is only convincing if you've been conditioned by months of intimidation and threats and gaslighting not to question its author. Oh, and we're still not done, because she had some additional thoughts in the comments. So, in response to someone informing her of my brief response on Twitter, Lily admonishes me for calling her a rape apologist because she thinks being a rape survivor should make her immune from criticisms for the things she said and did. She defends the writing contest with the "you don't have to enter" excuse that I debunked earlier. She hurls ableist abuse at me in calling me a loon, and she says,
"Stop drinking and make a coherent point, Levi."
And this hurt. At first, I thought it hurt to be accused of drinking when I don't drink specifically because my father was an alcoholic, and that is probably part of it. If nothing else, I want to point out that this is why you don't casually insult people like this, because you don't know what they've been through. But I think what really hurt about this is that she accuses me of being incoherent when my incoherence is a direct result of her deliberately ignoring and even lying about my arguments. She's chiding me for a wrongdoing she manufactured. She's basically asking me why I'm hitting myself. It's disempowering and humiliating. And if that isn't a microcosm of everything wrong with Lily, I don't know what is.